In the late 1940s, Russian scientists did an experiment where they kept 5 people awake for 15 days using a special gas that made them stay awake. They put them in a sealed room to watch how much oxygen they breathed because the gas could harm them if they used too much. At that time, they didn't have cameras like we do now, so they used microphones and small windows made of thick glass to see inside the room. Inside the room, they had books, beds to sleep on but no blankets, water, a toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 people for more than a month. The people they used in the experiment were prisoners who were considered enemies of the government during World War II. For the first 5 days, everything seemed okay. The people in the experiment didn't complain much because they were told they'd be set free if they endured the test and stayed awake for 30 days. Although this promise wasn't true, people watched what they said and did in the experiment, and they kept talking about really upsetting things from their past. Their conversations started to get darker after 4 days. After 5 days, they started to complain about their situation and got really paranoid. They stopped talking to each other and instead whispered to the microphones and looked through one-way mirrors. Strangely, they all thought they could gain the trust of the researchers by telling on their fellow captives. The other people stuck with them. At first, the researchers thought this might be because of the gas they were exposed to. After 9 days, one of them began screaming. He ran around the room, shouting loudly for 3 hours straight, and then he couldn't scream anymore, only making occasional squeaky sounds. The researchers thought he had hurt his vocal cords by screaming so much. What's really surprising is how the other captives reacted. Or rather, how they didn't react. They kept whispering into the microphones until the second person started to scream. The 2 people who weren't screaming took apart books, covered the glass windows with pages smeared with their own waste, and did it calmly. Strangely, the screaming stopped right after they did this. So, the talking into the microphones happened. Then, after 3 more days passed, the scientists checked the microphones every hour to make sure they were still working. They couldn't believe that there was no sound from the 5 people inside. The amount of oxygen being used in the chamber suggested that all 5 of them were still alive. It was as if they were doing very intense exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the scientists did something they had said they wouldn't do to try and get a reaction from the captives. They used a speaker inside the chamber, hoping to make the captives, who they were worried might be dead or unresponsive, react. They said, "We're opening the chamber. Move away from the door and lie down on the floor, or we'll shoot you. If you do what we say, one of you will be set free immediately." Surprisingly, they heard a calm voice saying, "We don't want to be set free anymore." This caused a big argument among the scientists and the military who were funding the research. They couldn't get any more responses through the intercom, so they decided to open the chamber on the 15th day at midnight. They got rid of the gas that was keeping them awake and filled the chamber with fresh air. Right away, voices from the microphones started protesting. 3 different voices were begging, as if they were pleading to keep the gas on, as if their lives depended on it. The chamber was opened, and soldiers went in to get the test subjects. When they saw what was inside, they screamed even louder. 4 out of the 5 subjects were still alive, but their condition couldn't really be called alive. After 5 days, the food given to the test subjects was left untouched. The drain in the middle of the room was clogged with pieces of meat from the dead subject's thighs and chest, causing 4 inches of water to collect on the floor. It was unclear how much of the water on the floor was actually blood. The surviving test subjects had significant injuries to their muscles and skin, especially on their fingertips, suggesting that the wounds were not caused by teeth but by their own hands. Further examination revealed that most, if not all, of the wounds were self-inflicted. The internal organs below the ribcage of all 4 test subjects were missing, although their hearts, lungs, and diaphragms were intact. The skin and muscles attached to the ribs had been torn off, exposing the lungs. The removed organs were placed on the floor around the subjects, who were still alive despite being eviscerated. It was discovered that the subjects were digesting their own flesh, which they had torn off and eaten over several days. Many of the soldiers at the facility were Russian special operatives, but even they were reluctant to enter the chamber and remove the test subjects. The subjects continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternated between begging and demanding that the gas be turned on again, fearing they would fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects fought fiercely when they were being taken out of the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died after his throat was torn out, while another suffered severe injuries, including having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg cut by one of the subject's teeth. In the weeks following the incident, 5 more soldiers lost their lives, including those who committed suicide. During the struggle, one of the 4 remaining subjects had his spleen ruptured, causing him to bleed out quickly. The medical researchers tried to calm him down with sedatives, but it didn't work. They injected him with a substance similar to morphine, more than 10 times the normal human dose, but he continued to fight aggressively, even breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. Surprisingly, His heart continued beating for 2 minutes after he had lost so much blood that there was more air than blood in his veins. Even after his heart stopped, he kept screaming and flailing for another 3 minutes, desperately trying to harm anyone nearby. He repeatedly shouted the word quote, "more" quote, weaker and weaker until he finally became silent. The 3 remaining test subjects were restrained and taken to a medical facility. The 2 subjects who still had their vocal cords intact kept begging for the gas, insisting that they needed to stay awake. The most severely injured of the 3 subjects was taken to the only surgical operating room in the facility. As they prepared him for the surgery to put his organs back inside his body, they found that the sedative they had given him had no effect. He fought fiercely against his restraints when they tried to use anesthetic gas to put him to sleep. He even managed to tear through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, despite a 200-pound soldier holding it down. They needed just a little more anesthetic than usual to make him unconscious, and the moment his eyelids closed, his heart stopped. During the autopsy of the subject who died on the operating table, they discovered that his blood had 3 times the normal amount of oxygen. His muscles, still attached to his bones, were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his intense struggle to resist sedation. Most of the bone fractures were caused by the tremendous strength exerted by his own muscles. The second surviving subject was the first to start screaming. He had damaged vocal cords, so he couldn't voice his objections or pleas during the surgery. However, he vigorously shook his head in disapproval when they approached him with the anesthetic gas. When someone reluctantly suggested performing the surgery without anesthesia, he nodded in agreement. Throughout the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what was left of his skin, he remained unresponsive. The surgeon in charge repeatedly said that the patient should technically be alive. One frightened nurse who assisted in the surgery mentioned that she saw the patient smile several times whenever their eyes met. After the surgery ended, the person who had it looked at the surgeon and started wheezing loudly, trying to talk but struggling. The surgeon thought it was something very important, so they got a pen and paper so the patient could write a message. The message was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 people who were part of the experiment also had the same surgery, but they didn't get any pain relief. They had to be injected with a drug that made them unable to move during the surgery. The surgeon found it really hard to do the surgery because these patients kept laughing the whole time. When the drug wore off, they tried to break free from their restraints. As soon as they could talk, all they asked for was a gas that kept them awake. The researchers wanted to know why they had hurt themselves, why they had torn out their own insides, and why they wanted the gas again. The only answer they got was, "I have to stay awake." All 3 of them were tied up even more securely and put back in the room. The researchers had messed up their project, and the military people who were funding it were very angry. They thought about putting the surviving patients to sleep forever, but their leader, a former KGB agent, thought there might still be some use in them and wanted to see what would happen if they were given the gas again. The researchers didn't like the idea, but they were overruled. After the surgery ended, the person who had it looked at the surgeon and started wheezing loudly, trying to talk but struggling. The surgeon thought it was something very important, so they got a pen and paper so the patient could write a message. The message was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 people who were part of the experiment also had the same surgery, but they didn't get any pain relief. They had to be injected with a drug that made them unable to move during the surgery. The surgeon found it really hard to do the surgery because these patients kept laughing the whole time. When the drug wore off, they tried to break free from their restraints. As soon as they could talk, all they asked for was a gas that kept them awake. The researchers wanted to know why they had hurt themselves, why they had torn out their own insides, and why they wanted the gas again. The only answer they got was, "I have to stay awake." All 3 of them were tied up even more securely and put back in the room. The researchers had messed up their project, and the military people who were funding it were very angry. They thought about putting the surviving patients to sleep forever, but their leader, a former KGB agent, thought there might still be some use in them and wanted to see what would happen if they were given the gas again. The researchers didn't like the idea, but they were overruled. Before they were sealed in the chamber again, the test subjects were connected to a brainwave monitor called an EEG. Their restraints were made more comfortable for long-term confinement. Surprisingly, when they heard they were going back on the gas, all 3 stopped struggling. It was clear they were fighting to stay awake. One of the subjects who could speak started humming loudly and non-stop. The one who couldn't speak tried to move his legs against the leather restraints, going left, right, left again, just to have something to focus on. The third subject was propping his head up on the pillow and blinking quickly. The researchers had wired the first subject for EEG, and they were closely watching his brain waves. Most of the time, they were normal, but sometimes they suddenly went flat, like he was experiencing brain death. Then they would return to normal. While everyone was focused on the paper with the brainwave patterns, one nurse noticed that his eyes closed just as his head touched the pillow. His brainwaves changed to show deep sleep, And then they flatlined for the last time, and his heart stopped at the same moment. The person who could still talk started screaming to be locked in the room. Their brain activity looked like someone who had just died from falling asleep. The commander ordered the room to be sealed with the 2 subjects and 3 researchers inside, but one of the researchers quickly pulled out a gun and shot the commander in the head. Then he shot the silent subject as well. He pointed his gun at the last subject, who was still tied to a bed. The rest of the medical and research team ran out of the room in fear. He shouted at the men on the table, asking what they were. The subject smiled and replied, "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that's inside all of you, wanting to break free from your deepest animal instincts. We're what you hide from when you go to bed at night. We're what you silence and immobilize with medication when you seek refuge from us in your dreams." The researcher hesitated, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The brain activity on the monitor went flat as the subject weakly said, "So, almost free." Subscribe to Dreadflix and share for more such spine-chilling videos and stories.